You're listening to the Plastic Shift Podcast. Welcome to the Plastic Shift Podcast. I'm Madhav Malhotra, one of the students at the Plastic Shift, and I'm reaching out to several experts working to solve issues with plastic pollution. This podcast showcases unique perspectives on this massive problem to identify what its most important aspects are. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm lucky to be joined by Emily Tipaldo, Executive Director at the US Plastics Pact. She has over 10 years of experience in the plastics industry, including everything from regulations to research in this space. Her work at the US Plastics Pact is now meant to draw together businesses, researchers, governments, and other stakeholders to better solve this problem in the next 5 years. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very much looking forward to learn more about the details of what you've been working on. And to begin, I know that with your background, you have an enormous amount of experience in this industry in a lot of different roles. So I'd love to just share a little bit more about your story, how you got started, and what you're working on now.
Sure, that's a big question. My name is Emily Tipaldo, and I'm the Executive Director of the US Plastics Pact. I've had a very non-traditional career trajectory. I'll say that sort of out of the gate. I've been Executive Director of the Pact for the past 7 or so weeks. The Pact recently launched at the end of August, and I came on shortly thereafter. Prior to joining the Pact, I worked for a small mission-driven data and technology consulting firm called More Recycling, and was with them for almost 2 years. And I would say they're best known for the work that they do on an annual basis to collect data around what is recycled or what gets collected for recycling in the US and Canada. They've since sort of started to move into the full North American picture into Mexico, but it's quite a unique data set. And from that, there are lots of industry relationships and other projects that we pursued. So that was a really interesting experience. And prior to joining More Recycling, I spent almost 10 years with the American Chemistry Council, which is a trade organization in the US for chemical and plastics manufacturers. And the last sort of half of my time there was with their plastics division, and specifically leading their packaging team, where I was able to spend a lot of time on sustainability. And I think that's really sort of where a little bit prior in some of my other roles with the association, but really with plastics, where I was able to gain a lot of experience, meet the broader value chain around plastic packaging. So meet the consumer brand companies and the converters, those companies actually making the packaging itself, and then the whole sort of ecosystem and infrastructure of waste and recycling in the US. So I do not have a technical background. I will say that. I have a history degree and then a master's degree in international relations. I think when I graduated from my master's program, if you had asked me where I would be in 2020, this is not the answer that I would give, but I wouldn't trade anything. It's been a great experience.
Yeah, and I think that it's very valuable to see your interdisciplinary skills and backgrounds in bringing you to where you are today, because I think that's very perfect to describe some of the work that is going on at the US Plastics Pact now. And I know reading just a little bit about it on your website, the vision is just to connect different types of stakeholders in the industry, but I guess to provide a little bit more context as to what, say, some of the longer term objectives are. I know you're just starting out, but could you give us some context as to that?
Yeah, certainly. And so the US Plastics Pact is part of a broader network of pacts globally. And it's tied to the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation out of the UK and their New Plastics Economy program. and their corresponding global commitment, which started, I believe, in 2016. So it's been a few years running. And now there are 9 plastics pacts globally. A couple of them are regional, and the others are country specific. So, as I mentioned, the US Pact just launched at the end of August. It's really meant to set the national framework in the US for a plastics circular economy specific to packaging, plastics packaging. So, sort of setting that vision for a circular economy for plastics packaging in the US. I think the US in particular, in relation to the other pacts, is unique in that we currently do not have any national corresponding legislation or regulation that is helping us to work toward some really ambitious targets that we have. And our 4 targets are similar to those that the other pacts also have, and similar to the vision and the goals of the new plastics economy work. So the first is focused around identifying unnecessary and problematic plastics packaging. And then once that's been identified, eliminate that from the US market. The second target is around 100% recyclability, compostability, or reusability of plastics packaging in the US market. The third target is effectively a 50% recycling or composting rate for plastics packaging in the US. And the fourth target is around the use of recycled content as well as bio-based content. So an average of 30% of post-consumer recycled content is to be used in plastic packaging or responsibly sourced bio-based material by 2025. So again, we're meant to be sort of the action agent, bringing together all of the players of the plastic packaging value chain to realize as a group collectively those 4 goals.
Mm-hmm. And especially right now, we're given the slowdown and the recovery after the economic recession right now is a very important opportunity. So I'm very glad to see this work. And with the US Plastics Pact, it seemed like the key idea was always to bring different types of stakeholders together, whether that be governments or whether that be businesses or even individual researchers. I was curious as to why this is so important and exactly what kind of problems can arise if we do not try to solve these problems, the 4 that you outlined, without working together to consider different perspectives on the issue.
That's a great question. And as I thought about it, particularly sort of coming into a new role and taking into account the 4 targets that we have, I would say each of the 4 targets, as well as just sort of the underlying need for the Plastics Pact in the US in particular, is that we dramatically lack value for a circular economy. Period. I mean, whether it's specific to plastics or if you're thinking more broadly in terms of other materials, like there is not value on many levels. And it's one of those things when you do think about the value chain where you need value sort of at each point along or within the circle or along the value chain in order for it to be sustainable from a business perspective and to live on. So, I mean, we need demand for recycled material. So the brands need to commit to buying recycled material and effectively using that in their products or the packaging, how they deliver their products to the market. There needs to be value in sort of trickling back from that demand in building out our capacity. So think about our recycling capacity. And this is one thing that I definitely learned in my previous role with the MORE team. We severely lack the ability in this country to handle all of what we generate. And because we lack the value, because there isn't enough demand, no one from a capital standpoint wants to invest in either building new recycling facilities or growing the existing capabilities that we have. And sort of then similarly down the line, because we don't have that value to process it and reuse it, we also don't have the value to collect it or sort it. So, our programs at a municipal level don't have the funding that's required just to cover operational expenses of sorting out all of these things. I mean, most of the US operates with a single stream recycling system still. We do not have extended producer responsibility. So it's upon the citizen and the taxpayer to fund waste and recycling. And as packaging formats have changed and markets have changed, the cost of doing that collection and sortation has dramatically gone up. So again, we sort of lack value at all points in the system. And even like a big multinational company won't be able to solve that challenge on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think you've hit the nail on the head right here with the economic incentives of the situation. And this is something that we've been deeply concerned about when looking at some research regarding how oil production has been changing in the last little while, and in particular how the production of byproducts from refining things like natural gas has been getting cheaper and cheaper, and there's just been more and more incentives for plastics producers to invest in that instead of, say, thinking about investing in gasoline production, which might have been a more typical use of these types of fossil fuels. And I definitely think that given these challenges, it's very, very important to consider the economic incentives of the situation, like you said, at every step of the chain and the life cycle of plastics. But I was actually very confused about thinking about how to address this problem. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how, if you could specify what the exact connection is between getting these economic incentives in place and getting stakeholders to work together.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in that one way to refer to it is the plastics paradox. As you've rightly pointed out, it's very cheap to pull things out of the ground. And at the same time, we've seen gasoline production or fuel demand, I should say, decrease. And so, as a way of offsetting that, plastics production has grown. But then now we find ourselves in this real serious place where plastic waste is a major global issue. And you, as the upstream industry, you can't produce your way out of that, even though, one of the reasons why you are using more plastics and why there is a decrease in demand for gasoline is because, say, vehicles are more fuel efficient because they are using more plastics in their construction. So it's this very weird situation. And you are right in that the system, I mean, this is true globally, but I mean, as well as from a US specific standpoint, is that you have extreme subsidies on the front end. So again, the extraction industry, and it's not gas, but not mining, other things too, but definitely, oil and gas heavily subsidized. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's very cheap to put things in a landfill in the US today. But the guys in the middle, like the recycling industry, don't benefit from those economic realities, like all the way upstream and all the way downstream. It's extremely tough to compete, and in many instances, they just can't. So, speaking on behalf of Emily, I think we need to seriously question the subsidies that are happening all the way upstream because it's distorting the market. But speaking as part of the pact, I mean, I think that's where we look as a value chain in terms of how both through sort of healthy market pressure toward achieving sustainability and circularity goals, coupled with sort of the right policy levers will come into play to help create that value in the system for using more recycled content and for therefore building out the supply and the capacity that's needed and would go along with that demand.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the two approaches are one, the overall systemic level,
Mm-hmm.
and then two, the micro level,
Mm-hmm.
like considering the individual business, looking at their incentives, how are they going to change their materials, etc.
Yeah, if I can add one quick last thing. There have been discussions as well, and this is just sort of speaking generally, not pact specific at this point, but around the potential use of a carbon tax. And I think, as with all things in life, there are benefits and drawbacks of doing that. I mean, it could wind up being sort of regressive on those within our economy who aren't able to handle it, but at the same time, it could have the effect of balancing out some of those upstream, misaligned economic incentives.
Yeah. I think that there are a lot of very interesting policy options, and I think it's great to see that you are aware of this and bringing this perspective to a lot of different stakeholders at the Plastic Pact. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about where we are at today when it comes to different stakeholders cooperating together right now and how that has changed, say, over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I think businesses have realized there is a lot sort of that can be accomplished in a pre-competitive space, particularly when you're thinking about challenges that certainly do go beyond any one company. If you're thinking about sort of sourcing or feedstock or reverse logistics, as well as thinking about sort of related to meeting sustainability goals, oftentimes that's coupled with the need for some sort of standards or certifications around different things. Right now, there's a lot of talk about standards around post-consumer resin verification, or people are talking about mass flow balance approaches and sort of who is best situated to create that standard. And so I think that's where two companies and organizations see the value of, in a pre-competitive manner, coming together to help set some of those parameters.
Yeah. And the reason I wanted to ask was I think it's very important to consider the historical context of this because, as you said, you're trying to get all this done by 2025
Mhm.
with those goals.
I was just going to say, I think one other really important thing about the pact, which sets itself apart from most, is a piece around transparency and accountability. So while there are lots of voluntary commitments out there, the transparency and accountability piece is really important. So each signatory to the US Pact will be reporting on an annual basis, and then that data will be aggregated. So we have a look against the progress that we're making toward the 4 targets. So I do think that's important in terms of holding people accountable. Like, if you want to participate in this and be part of this effort, then sort of you need to take responsibility, however that makes sense to your company or organization.
Yeah, definitely. And hopefully we start to see this be an exception in how we accelerate the progress of work with the US Plastics Pact. And
Mm-hmm.
that gets to the last questions I had for you around how you're thinking about the future here. Because as I was saying, in the past, it has been that we unfortunately have not seen the urgency we need. So if you were to think about the most underexplored areas that different stakeholders have been looking into, what would you say the people that you're working with need to prioritize more of or stop doing entirely?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things which is a key element of the pact, which has sort of gone by the wayside in the US, is the idea of reuse or refill models. And so I think that's something that we'll probably do a series of pilots or projects around. I know there's a lot of interest in that. And just sort of really challenging ourselves to think about how we deliver product to the market, and how can we do that in a way that lowers the environmental footprint and does so in sort of in a circular way. So I think that's one definite area. I think the whole idea around reduction. So even if you think about, people like to talk about the waste hierarchy, and you always start out with reduce before you do anything else. And that's one I think that makes many in the US nervous just from a business standpoint, but that's something that we'll have to navigate in a meaningful way. And I think that will be instructive to see, to again, to sort of force us to look at, how we're delivering product, how it is or is not able to sort of come back to be reused or recycled in some way. And if not, why? And sort of asking all of those questions. This is a great space for that.
Yeah, definitely. We were recently talking to TerraCycle's Loop, and they're doing great work on I know you mentioned reverse logistics earlier and also reuse now. So it's really exciting to see all these new ventures to increase the pace of development in this space. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing the updates over the next little while with the US Plastics Pact and all the others as well. So thank you for taking the time to kind of share this both systemic and low-level perspective on these problems and all the areas where we rapidly need to make a change.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Please stay tuned because we have a lot coming online, and hopefully we'll be able to unite with our northern counterparts, as their pact comes together. So it should be an interesting time.